In 2016, a cargo helicopter hovered above the upper reaches of the Salmon River in the Canadian province of New Brunswick. Within specialized enclosures on its deck rested dozens of Atlantic salmon specimens, cultivated at the Marine Conservation Facility in Dark Harbor. The biologists who carefully loaded the fish that morning clearly comprehended exactly what was at stake. For decades, the Atlantic salmon within the inner Bay of Fundy had been quietly vanishing from these waterways, generation after generation, until the entire massive population had dwindled to merely a few dozen individuals. This operation was not merely another reintroduction of a species into the wild. It was an unprecedented test of whether something almost entirely lost could be restored, starting literally from nothing. Ultimately, this daring maneuver allowed the massive restoration project to reach the finish line, despite a whole series of unforeseen hardships. To this day, 13,230 individual salmon have been released into these rivers, and more than 700 of them have already migrated back, representing the highest figure in recent decades. However, what subsequently happened to the river itself did not fit into a single original scientific model. Tim Robinson is not a native resident of this area. He arrived at the Fort Folly First Nation community in 1995, serving as a habitat restoration specialist, and stayed there permanently. This was followed by 20 years of continuous labor, securing grants, arduous field research, lengthy negotiations, and additional grants. In May 2015, he stood on the bank of the Pollitt River next to a brand new device, a rotating fry-catching drum approximately 1 meter in diameter, which was propelled by the current itself. The fish entered it autonomously. During the initial weeks, the trap caught only a handful of individuals. Every morning, technicians traveled to the site, manually extracted the fish, and transferred them into transport tanks filled with chilled water. Every wild smolt, translucent, between 7 and 10 centimeters long, with dark oval spots along its sides, was registered, tagged, and dispatched to the marine facility in Dark Harbor on Grand Manan Island. The primary goal consisted of raising them to adulthood in a secure environment and subsequently returning them for natural spawning into the wild river. At that time, Robinson directly stated to reporters that previously up to 40,000 adult salmon would return here, while today fewer than 200 remained, placing the species on the verge of complete extinction. The transportation process in itself was a massive experiment. The live juveniles were conveyed in tanks containing chilled salt water across the Bay of Fundy to Grand Manan. Fundy is considered one of the most turbulent bodies of water in the entire Atlantic. It experiences the highest tides in the world, where the difference between low and high water reaches 17 meters. There were absolutely no instructions for executing such an operation with wild fish. The crew authored these rules on the fly, learning from their own missteps. Yet these smolts had already spent 2 or 3 years in their native river. They had permanently memorized the unique chemical scent of the pedicodiac. This specific fact distinguished this approach from any previous hatchery program in this region, although at that time, almost no one paid attention to it. To comprehend why this scent carried such colossal importance, one must travel back 47 years. Prior to 1968, the Pedicodiac River provided approximately 20% of the entire Atlantic salmon population within the inner Bay of Fundy. Fishing records documented up to 5,000 adult individuals annually in this single river alone. For the Mi'kmaq people, whose word denoting salmon appeared in ancient texts much earlier than most modern geographical names, this fish was far from merely food. The name Pedicodiac itself originates from an ancient term signifying a river that bends like a bow. They had harvested fish here for millennia, but the salmon encountered a new adversary. It was neither a predator nor a poacher, but a monolithic concrete structure 1.4 kilometers in length, erected across the waterway by the provincial government in just 2 years. It was not intended for generating electrical power or protecting against floods. This causeway simply shortened the vehicular route between two cities. The convenience of brief commutes cost the river 40 years of its life. In 1968, this barrier transformed 21 kilometers of a living, pulsating estuary into a shallow freshwater reservoir. The fish could no longer migrate upstream to spawn. Smolts swimming down the river entered stagnant water and simply vanished. In 1989, salmon harvesting was completely prohibited in all rivers of the inner Bay of Fundy. The logic of the authorities was extremely straightforward. If pressure from anglers was removed, the population would recover on its own. 10 years passed, then another 20. The fish continued to disappear. This strict prohibition remains in effect today. Children raised near Moncton after 1968 had never witnessed a spawning run. The grandchildren of fishermen who still remembered thousands of fish grew up next to an empty river and considered this the absolute norm. By the early 2000s, the figure of fewer than 200 fish across the entire inner Bay of Fundy, distributed across 33 rivers, became an undeniable scientific fact. This was no longer shocking. It became merely a dry line in a report. In 2003, the inner Bay of Fundy subpopulation was officially added to the list of species facing an imminent threat of extinction. For the local communities, this signified much more than just a registry status. Chief Joseph Knockwood had been demanding the removal of the causeway since the 90s, when the majority of government agencies deemed it utterly unrealistic. He actively lobbied for the interests of the river, built partnerships, and prepared young community members for labor that had not even commenced at that point. The gates of the causeway opened only in 2010. Replacing this barrier with a fully functional bridge cost $61,600,000. Construction was completely finalized in 2021, 53 years after the causeway's erection. Unfortunately, Chief Knockwood did not live to see the large-scale fish release in 2024. The very concept of restoration was repeatedly obstructed, even before becoming a fully fledged initiative, with blows landing from various directions simultaneously. Point 1. The defenders of nature from the Conservation Council of New Brunswick carefully scrutinized the project partner, a major aquaculture enterprise, and perceived a corporation that in 2011 paid a penalty of $500,000 for the unlawful application of chemicals that devastated lobsters in the bay. This constituted the largest fine in the entire history of Canadian fisheries. This identical company recorded escapes from its netted enclosures, causing genetically weakened farmed fish to infiltrate wild salmon populations. The logic of the ecologists was rock solid. One cannot entrust the salvation of a species to one of the parties directly accountable for its decline. Point 2. The researchers observed the statistics and witnessed the same sorrowful pattern unfolding globally. Breeding programs in hatcheries on the Atlantic coast yielded minimal results. Captive reared fish returned from the sea in far smaller numbers than wild specimens. They rivaled wild fish for sustenance and diluted unique local genetic adaptations. It was precisely on this data that the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada had built its extremely cautious stance since the 90s, and they possessed valid justifications for doing so. Point 3. There was an additional, purely physical complication. Even if the marine facility operated flawlessly, the river still remained obstructed. The causeway stood until 2010. Tim Robinson stated directly back in 2016 that merely opening the gates would not replenish the population. It remained critically diminished, and without decisive supplementary measures, the numbers would not ascend. However, all these three objections were built upon a single erroneous assumption: that this endeavor was simply another hatchery, a mundane attempt to substitute natural spawning with artificially reared fish. In reality, everything was different. The smolts gathered by the squad had already spent 2 or 3 years in the untamed river. They concealed themselves beneath stones, hunted insects, and absorbed the scent of the pedicodiac. They were not raised at the facility from the egg stage, they were merely sheltered there. Sheltered from the most perilous phase of their life journey, the entry into the open ocean. where between 90 and 97% of adolescent salmon perish. The facility was not a replacement for nature. It served as a bridge over the bleakest and most hazardous stretch of the path. Yet this was only the beginning. The adversary had not vanished anywhere. It simply assumed novel forms. In August 2023, a wild seal breached the protective netting at the facility in the Bay of Fundy. Shortly thereafter, over 60 farmed salmon were logged at the fish counting station on the Magaguadavic River, in the exact location where the Atlantic Salmon Federation has conducted monitoring since 1992. A farmed salmon in a wild river is not just a superfluous fish. It crossbreeds with wild individuals, and their hybrids survive significantly worse. A representative of the Conservation Council of New Brunswick briefly summarized the situation at the time. This occurs constantly, and every time the enterprise emerges completely unscathed. The initiative was replenishing the population in one section of the bay, while in another section of the bay, that very same corporation continued to degrade it. Both of these processes transpired simultaneously within the exact same waters. In October 2021, the initial substantial data arrived. Kurt Samways, a researcher from the University of New Brunswick who conducted continuous monitoring of the waterways in the national park, reviewed the figures and published what he observed. During that season, over 100 adult salmon returned to the park's rivers, achieving the highest mark since 1989. Concurrently, more than 4,000 wild smolts migrated from the rivers into the sea, establishing a 20-year record. Samways examined these two metrics together and stated a profoundly simple thing. The population was not merely surviving, it was beginning to reproduce autonomously. This already surpassed all bold expectations, but Samways continued to analyze the information. The genuine surprise emerged from a place nobody was even looking. Samways focused his attention on one crucial detail. Adult salmon returning to the river to spawn either remain there permanently or linger for an extended period, and their bodies deliver invaluable marine nutrients to the freshwater system: nitrogen, phosphorus, and organic matter. Juveniles developing in such water acquire a vastly richer forage base. Samways explained to the press that these elements settle within the river and are absorbed by the entire ecosystem. They supply supplementary nourishment for the subsequent generation of salmon, rendering nature itself healthier and more productive. There was yet another indicator that the scientist highlighted separately: the proportion of fish returning to spawn more than once, for a second and even a third time, was expanding. The majority of hatchery programs log only the initial return and consider the cycle concluded. But here, the fish returned over and over again. This signified that they had not merely survived in the untamed water, they had adapted to it so profoundly that they could repeatedly complete the full natural cycle. Shortly thereafter, Samways began collecting water samples from tributaries that were physically almost impossible to reach. He was searching neither for the fish itself, nor for tracks on the shoreline, but solely for the water. In the laboratory, these specimens were tested for the presence of genetic traces, the materials that salmon leave behind simply by the fact of their presence: scales, mucus, fragments of DNA. In several tributaries, the analysis yielded positive results. The fish were genuinely there. According to all prior studies, they had not been there for decades. Nobody knew precisely when exactly they had returned and how many were hiding there. The skeptics from the conservation councils did not withdraw their objections, even after the publication of these brilliant outcomes. Their rigid stance regarding the perils of open-netted enclosures remained unaltered, and not without foundation. However, while the arguments persisted, the river was already living its own life. Every autumn, Tim Robinson and the crew from Fort Folly walked along the banks of the Pollitt and Petticodiac rivers carrying heavy buckets. Adult salmon, each between 60 and 80 centimeters in length, weighty and prepared to spawn, were unloaded from chilled tanks into rubber sacks and carried to the water. Every fish was gently lowered, held against the current until it began to confidently propel its fins. What occurred next was planned by no one. Neither the project's advocates nor the skeptics, who were still intently scrutinizing the reports. Each adult fish, having expended its energy after spawning, leaves behind in the river what it brought with it from the ocean: organic compounds accumulated over months of feeding on Atlantic herring and mackerel. In the upper reaches of the Salmon River, where the salmon had once completely vanished, this marine subsidy had been absent for decades. When the fish began to return in massive numbers, the overall productivity of the river sharply surged. According to researchers' data, more nutrients meant more plankton, more invertebrates, and more sustenance for adolescent salmon. Yet something proved to be even more incredible. In 2021 and 2022, investigators started noticing kingfishers and minks on the rivers, animals that had not been seen here for an eternity. When the fish returned, so did the creatures that feed upon them. A trophic cascade was initiated, a grandiose restoration of the food chain that commenced with just a single returned fish. Nothing of the sort existed in any of the initial blueprints or indicators of the enterprise. In 1998, the Fort Folly community participated in the inaugural meeting of the Recovery Group in conjunction with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. This marked the premier attempt to coordinate efforts throughout the entire Inner Bay. In 2001, the community forged a fully fledged partnership with the National Parks of Canada. 14 years of complex field labor, securing grants, and unsuccessful attempts allowed them to refine the approach sufficiently to transfer it to the Petitcodiac River. In September 2015, the community officially launched the recovery program within the basin of this river, the very same one that once provided 20% of the entire regional population, and where in 2003, researchers found virtually not a single wild fish. In October 2024, the squad released a record quantity of fish into the Petitcodiac River, over 1,300 adult salmon. The water blessing ceremony and the release itself were conducted by Elder Donna Augustine and knowledge keeper Nicole Porter. This event was dedicated to the bright memory of Chief Joseph Knockwood, the man who began demanding the demolition of the causeway back in the 90s and became the first Indigenous leader to give this initiative an organizational framework. During that identical year, this program received the prestigious status of a United Nations flagship initiative for global restoration, becoming one of the most effective ecological projects on the planet. In parallel with rescuing the fish, the project was also rehabilitating the people themselves. Young members of the community underwent training and became river technicians, learning how to install fry wheels, tag fish, and interpret monitoring data. As noted by one of the premier technical specialists, this possessed colossal cultural significance. The program not only provided employment, but also transferred vital knowledge to new generations. Meanwhile, Tim Robinson declares that this triumphant approach is already beginning to be applied on other rivers as well. He mentions the Tantramar and Memramcook rivers not merely as abstract blueprints, but as realistic possibilities, provided funding is secured. He honestly acknowledges that a single river will not be able to restore the entire population, but the more rivers involved, the higher the overall odds of success. At the dawn of 2026, the Specialized Association published the final statistics, according to which the total quantity of adult salmon released throughout the entire history of the enterprise reached 13,230 individuals. 700 tagged fish successfully returned. 3,047 individuals are gathering strength right now at the marine facility in Dark Harbor. During the spring, several dozen wild smolts will depart this section of the river and journey to the sea. The majority of them will not survive this voyage. Such is the harsh statistic of the wilderness, and it remains immutable. However, in 3 or 4 years, certain individuals among them will absolutely return from the deep ocean back into their native river. 13,230 adult fish have returned to their waters. Over 1 million eggs and smolts were released into the Petitcodiac River basin. Nature knows how to forgive our mistakes and rejuvenate itself, if we merely grant it the chance to do so and provide a little assistance along the most challenging segment of the path.